Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager here, and I'm pleased to be joined by Connor Tomlinson. Connor is a great host over at Lotus Eaters for the Tomlinson Talk Show, and he's also a contributor over at GB News and Talk TV. Connor, how have you been?
Good, thank you very much. Despite the rapid deterioration of my country, morally and infrastructurally all around me, my personal life's great, and cheers for inviting me on.
Well, I'm sure we'll get into that. And speaking of your personal life, people are they know you for your fiery takes over at the Lotus Eaters that are at the same time very rational. But I don't think they know much about your story as a Catholic and your reversion to Catholicism. Could you tell us what brought you back to the Catholic faith and her teachings?
Yeah, I think I've only ever told the story vaguely once before on a podcast with a Christian friend of mine who is not yet Catholic, but we're nudging him. But so I was baptized as a kid because my parents got married in the Catholic Church, and half my family's Irish, so it's unavoidable. But I was not a regular church attendee as a child. I went to a Church of England primary school, actually, just because it was local and the results were good, though I didn't have a very good time. But and then in 2008, my uncle took his own life, hit by a train. Very sad. He actually was the one that imparted upon me a comic book addiction, which was horrendous for my wallet for many years. And then now over at the Lotus Eaters, I get paid to talk about that on a series with my co-host Harry. So thank you very much, Uncle Tony. But it really impacted my family.
Mm-hmm.
My nan and my granddad are very sort of strong characters, and as a kid, I didn't see how badly it hurt them at the time, but obviously it was a deep wound, and they found solace in going back to their local church and involving themselves in the Catenians Association, doing charity work for local homeless associations and hosting dinners. My granddad ended up becoming president of that association when he was still relatively mobile. But my mum started taking us when I was a kid. And so my mum went to a Catholic secondary school, and she now works in another Catholic secondary school as one of their pastoral care coordinators, and so she's always felt a great affinity to the ethos and the community. But as a kid, me being very impatient, I just wanted to get home and play my Nintendo DS, so I didn't really appreciate it, And I went through confirmation, and then I sort of drifted away because in a very fallen and secular culture, you don't have much connective tissue to the underlying moral substrata that gives your political institutions and your culture the sort of moral justification above all other cultures, particularly that of the Anglosphere. I'll encompass Canada and the US and the like in this. And so I just coasted along on unexamined suppositions for a long time, while also being very nihilistic and not really feeling invested in a narrative of my future and of the future of my community and my nation and what kind of family I wanted to build. And then it was around 2019 when I had already been sort of swimming in political milieu. I'd been listening to not just the hilarious SJW cringe compilations that sort of men of Gen Z variety grew up on, but also listening to like Jordan Peterson and various intellectual, cultural Christians like that. And I was both persecuted by my university at the time and had a relationship fall through. And I had to piece my own worldview back together. And it was strange that all of the best people that I knew in conservative circles were Christians. All the best people I knew personally were Christians. And it wasn't until a couple of years later when a former friend said to me what the catalyst to him going back to mass was and properly believing was just making the adult decision to go, well, just believe it, you idiot, and see what happens. That I had the humility just to sort of start going to local mass with my nan, funnily enough. And it turns out that my local priest actually watches my show, which is a hilarious little coincidence. I try not to read too much into signs and wonders in my own life because that would be sort of presumptive arrogance on my part, but I can't help but feel it a little bit there. And ever since I've loved attending every Sunday. I now go with my girlfriend, and I feel that Catholicism is one of the only things which gives the body politic a sense of the dignity of the human person upon which all other suppositions rest. And without it, I think we just sort of float off into abstraction. So I've clung quite fast to it.
Hmm. You mentioned those commentators that sort of pushed you in that direction. I noticed recently in a tweet that you had about the Daily Wire situation, you talked about Andrew Klavan, how he was one of those people who sort of nudged you in that direction. Do you think that how important do you think it is for Catholicism to adopt this inherent traditionalism, this inherent conservatism? Of course, we have this crisis in the church where we have a lot of liberals going around. We have a lot of people undermining those traditional structures. How important is it for Catholicism to adopt that traditional roots?
Well, I almost want to invert your question a little bit and speak maybe from the English context, because I don't want to speak for all of my colleagues in North America, but your guys' constitutions and how you think about yourselves does really rest on how the English thought of themselves once. Catholicism is actually inseparable from the English political tradition up until around Henry VIII decided he wanted to commit adultery and ransack all the monasteries, and instigated hundreds of years of religious warfare, which resulted in liberalism to be exported throughout the world in a secular, mechanistic fashion. And so it's not necessarily that Catholicism needs to adopt the return with a V to tradition sentiment of lots of Gen Z reactionaries. It's actually that they're finding Catholicism as the fertile roots of a rather attractive flower that's sprouting up despite a deracinated soil. And so if you look at the roots of those traditions, you'll find the true church and Christianity as the legitimating factor from which different parochial expressions of that have flowed outwards. I think, I'm happy to playfully disparage some of my Anglican brothers and sisters over in this country, but the best elements of Anglicanism is a sort of English expression of Catholicism, even though we quibble about theology and hierarchy there. But as to the Daily Wire thing, yeah, I mean, again, one of my favorite people over there is Michael Knowles, and I think it's because he has the most robust sense of how to apply right reason within a moral framework that has a metaphysical justification. Because a lot of the time in American conservative circles, especially, and again, I'm listening as an outsider here with great admiration, you hear a lot of, well, the Constitution says so, therefore, and
Mhm.
the Constitution is presumed to be self-evidently correct. But then they never get to the part of why we should buy into the dignity of the human person, why we should value human life to the extent that it should be protected by force, why our right to speak and freely associate and practice religious worship should be protected because the human itself is valuable. And I think among the American conservatives, among increasingly, okay, hopefully increasingly, some British conservatives, we're seeing that revival of Catholicism because they've looked at the tradition and found this is where it's come from.
Mhm. No, that's fascinating. You mentioned that the expression of the popular expression of Catholicism is so tied in with the English political tradition. Something I wanted to ask you about that is, we of course as Americans, it's this eternal struggle of trying to figure out how we can balance being Americans and loving our country, knowing that it was founded on Freemasonry and liberal principles with, of course, traditional Catholicism. I think there's a similarity when it comes to England and the United Kingdom because of how much John Locke and John Stuart Mill have had their influence on the English political tradition. Do you find that there is a similar struggle that Englishmen have to make in order to find how their Catholicism harmonizes with their identity as Englishmen?
Oh, I love how loaded that question is. So I'll separate the
Oh.
American, because I've got things to say about the American tradition actually, because it greatly disappoints me that lots of American conservatives have kind of relinquished the founding creation myth to being that of secular liberalism.
Mm,
Because, of course, the founding fathers didn't establish a national church. This is despite the Federalists wanting to do so. But obviously, the sort of Jeffersonians ran out of time. But the phrase liberal democracy is not found in any of the documents until well after the Second World War. Even FDR was talking about Christian democracy. Again,
mm,
that underlying moral substrata. Yes, they were Protestants, God bless them. Which I have my thoughts on how that led ineluctably to secular liberalism, but I'll pipe that for a minute there. But the idea that you can decouple the American founding from the Christian faith is broadly impossible, because when they said freedom of religion, they basically meant freedom of Christian denomination. And we know this because John Adams, the man who said, our constitution is meant for moral and religious people, the one time that he said that America is not a Christian nation was when negotiating with the Muslim Barbary pirates, because he had to sort of lie his way into getting them on the same negotiating terms. But that certainly isn't how it was practiced. Yes, of course, you had Ben Franklin and the likes, and you had deism, which was a lot more of a mechanistic way of viewing things than theism. But obviously, Christianity informed the American founding. Now, looking at England, I mean, the problem we have now with Locke and Mill is that liberalism is an ideology. So Michael Oakeshott said that ideologies are kind of abstractions of a particular tradition from a time and place to then be made universal, as if you can pick it up and just drop it anywhere, right? And so liberalism is how the English people historically thought of themselves, exported to non-Englishmen. This is why America had a liberal founding, but it was all founded by Christian Englishmen who just thought, of course, all men are created free and equal. We think this is self-evident because all we know are Christian Englishmen. They didn't really think that people with incompatible traditions and faiths would arrive on their shores and fundamentally change the character and interpretation of the Constitution. And so what we've got since then, because of the rise of the American hegemony, specifically after the Second World War, where they displaced the British Empire as the predominant power, is we've got a folding back of liberalism on top of England with a sort of American institutionalism and a constitutionalism where we didn't have it before. And so now we've got the liberal tradition grating against the English tradition. And it's kind of like coming home to see someone wearing the skin of your wife and demanding that they love you. It's not quite, like, you kind of look like my wife, but you don't really sound and act like her. And there's something off here. And I think what we're beginning to see in English political discourse is the seams of where it doesn't quite meet up.
Interesting. You in your commentary there on the American founding, you talked about really how it's Christian democracy broadly. You've got different denominations coming together. I think there's a parallel today with the rise of it's an ill-defined term, but Christian nationalism. Do you see a problem with traditional Catholics having to unite with non-Catholics in order to bring about their political goals? Because what's coming to mind is, of course, the political movements of the early 20th century and the 19th century. You can look in France, Action Française, for example. These movements that eventually they had major problems with them. Do you see Christian nationalism as something that we should embrace, or something that we should be cautious of?
So I know the anti-woke coalition, which is kind of operating like a post-Cold War version of fusionism at the moment, where you have sort of Catholic conservatives and secular liberals allied against what they think woke is, even though they can't really define it on shared terms. That coalition is it's fractioning in the same way that they will over the trans issue, with the sort of trans exclusionary radical feminists over Christian nationalism, because what the secular liberals think is that you can confine all public conceptions of the good to the private sphere, whereas the people who are either Christian nationalists or ones who aren't afraid of it recognize that there is no such thing as neutrality on moral concerns. If you confine one conception of moral goods to the private sphere, then you allow its antonym to also coexist with it and slowly destroy it. So you are actually taking a proactive moral position. You just have the sort of presumptive arrogance that you can contain both incompatible conceptions within the same thing. Multiculturalism operates the same way in Britain. You have an established church, but then you also import loads of Islamists, and suddenly we're celebrating Ramadan over Easter. So anyway, parking that. Christian nationalism, I don't know if you've read William Wolf's book, or Stephen Wolfe rather, because William and Stephen are both in this movement. But Stephen Wolfe's book, Christian Nationalism, I could never call myself Christian nationalist. And I think Yoram Hazony does a really good thing in Conservatism and Rediscovery, saying why Christian nationalism makes sense for America. Because it is an Americanism, because America is a propositional nation, whereas England is like an old world nation. But again, we don't have an explicit constitution, but that explicit constitution is not liberal. It's actually founded on Christian suppositions. So to be a Christian nationalist does make sense for Americans. I just don't see Stephen Wolfe's version of it rising anytime soon, because he does essentially call for a Christian prince or a kind of Caesar figure, sort of Roman Republic clause that says in times of crisis we can have a temporary dictator. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens accidentally, given the upcoming elections. So with Christian nationalism, I neither identify with it nor am I worried about it. But it's not quite the aberration to the American tradition as a lot of anti-woke liberals would have people believe.
Let me get more to the core of the question, which would be, do you think that when it comes to the traditionalist movement, if we want to put, give a label to it, or the conservative movement, if we want to use that term, do you think that it's necessary for Catholics within that movement to insist on it being explicitly Catholic? Do you see that as being the future for this, or do you see a need to have a temporary compromise just to fight back this leviathan that we have today of wokeism, if we want to call it that, or just really the outcome of what liberalism has given us?
So it's necessary for us to insist on following Catholic doctrine because that is what our heart commands. We're commanded to evangelize, and we think this is correct, and so we shouldn't suppress this. I do think, for the time being, it won't cause problems insofar as we're trying to smite the enemy, which I think you can accurately characterize wokeness as satanic for many different reasons, mainly because it functions like demonic possession as well, because people are just advancing this ideology. Many of them aren't even advancing it for like dark triad style personal gain. Some of them are just advancing it in suicidal fashion, akin to the possessed hogs jumping into the lake and drowning. So I do foresee there being issues should we win. And I hope we will. We'll win ultimately, but in the political battle at least, not in the theological battle. Because in Stephen Wolf's book, actually, he does say that there is going to be problems here because America is a Protestant nation, and so we're going to have issues with the Baptists on when exactly we can baptize them, and we're going to have issues with the Catholics because they've basically got dual loyalty to the Vatican. And I was reading that, I was like, hang on a minute, mate. Do you really want to be picking this fight right now when we're slightly on the back foot? So I foresee that being a theological quibble down the line. But I don't think we're going to be excised from any kind of movement, particularly from our fellow Christians, for asserting, well, this is our particular interpretation of the doctrine. This is the doctrine we think is true. Unlike, I think, increasingly, the anti-woke liberals will be slowly pushed out of whatever forward-thinking, comprehensive conception of the good movement goes forward.
Interesting. When it comes to this movement, something we've done on this show is we encourage people to go back and read Metternich, de Maistre, Fillmore to some extent. Do you think that is the way forward? Looking in the past, in the sort of 19th century reaction to liberalism and using that as a foundation, or do you think that we need a new foundation? We need to sort of start from scratch, using a Catholic teaching, using Christian and Western culture, but sort of figuring out a different attack plan, a different foundation for how we can fight against this current problem that we have?
So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. How do I put this? I don't see any appetite for Filmer happening anytime soon, particularly because the British monarchy, even though I revere the institution as part of tradition, the people currently occupying its throne / those closest to the throne are not exactly allied with me or you on what they might think. So absolute monarchy I don't see coming to fruition. I do see a bit of de Maistrean thinking here, though, in that we can all ally under the teachings of the Catholic Church. Perhaps we have some differences with Pope Francis at the moment, but okay, and particularly the Gospels. But in our parochial expressions of these things, we can take a perennialist view. We can have geographically, culturally bound, diverse, as is the flavor of the day, expressions of how we do things. And this is what de Maistre meant by a people gets the government that it deserves. It's not necessarily that, oh, you voted these guys in, so if they betray you, no. The governments are often, well, at least before the fallout of the Second World War and sort of international liberal order that tries to homogenize everything, governments were particular expressions of the character of their peoples. And you still see that in the non-liberalized world, for example, Saudi Arabia and the like, where they can be incredibly materially prosperous, but also very collectivist and very Islamist. And so I would expect a fractionating and a movement back to that if organic politics is allowed to play out, of course, because there are still international institutions trying to exert a lot of political, ideological, and financial pressure over different nations trying to break away. I mean, the best example of this is El Salvador, right? I would love if Britain had its own Bukele, not just because he retweeted me. You know, I'm slightly vain like that, but what he's done with El Salvador, he's locked up about 2% of the adult population because they all had skull-based face tattoos because they were literally a satanic gang. And suddenly it's gone from one of the most dangerous places in the world to peaceful and prosperous. Stands on the balcony of a neoclassical palace with his wife and kids, thanking the 92% of people that gave him an approval rating, the 85% of people that elected him in, and saying, this is wonderful, I did this all for you. And everyone's going, wow, this looks like a fantastic country. It looks like he's sheltered from the collapse of the petrodollar. It looks like it's all going to be good. And then suddenly the US State Department and the UN start threatening sanctions just because he's doing things that are against this nebulous conception of human rights, which demands in blank slate fashion, you extend the same consideration, even more so, more lenient consideration, to a murderous criminal than you would the family of their victims. And he just goes, no, screw off. I think if we can have the no screw off mentality of Bukele, we'll be able to have some more parochial expressions of the underlying substrata, which is the truth of Christianity.
When it comes to a more practical political note in the United Kingdom, I got to say, from the outside looking in, it looks absolutely bleak. Of course, the Conservatives are on their way to a historic loss to Labour in the next election. At least that's what it's looking like. But what I wanted to ask you about is the Reform UK political party that it's been promoted to some extent as a sort of alternative to the Conservatives, but of course recently they've sort of exiled some of their candidates. I know Beau from the Lotus Eaters running for, I think, Swindon South. They detached themselves from him, and more recently they've detached themselves from a few other members running for office. Do you think that Reform UK is a salvageable party, or is the United Kingdom in need for a new political party to come in and apply traditionalist principles?
So Reform UK are a business and not a party, and that's something that people will do well to remember. This is why it is governed with a lot of PR in mind, and that's why it's governed as a sort of fiefdom by its head, Richard Tice, who has always been polite to me, and has seemingly taken my opinions on board on political matters in the past, but not ones of strategy, because he does take things personally, and therefore he governs who is allowed as a position of legitimacy within the alternative party. And if he's listening to our political enemies who would sooner see us dead than succeed on who should be selected, then I don't think they're going to be a movement with any legs, not unless you have a complete change of the leadership from the top. And I don't see that happening anytime soon, especially not ahead of the next election. Also, with Reform UK, on various moral issues, if you're voting with a Catholic conscience, not just on pure political pragmatism, not just on sort of incremental change, or trying to take a sledgehammer to the uniparty paradigm of Conservative and Labour, then you can't vote for them because they're pro-abortion. They have various different permissive social policies. They're essentially like microwaved Margaret Thatcher. And so that is unsatisfying for me and plenty of other young men specifically, and some young women, you know, hashtag not all, who are a lot more socially conservative than their boomer Gen X forebears for during the Cold War, who just wanted to defeat communism. And then thought that the 1990s was the end of history and that things would only get better under Tony Blair. So do I think there is a viable political movement at the moment? No. Do I see one coming through the midst? No. Is this going to take a few more years for quite a few people that are supporting the current paradigm to retire and step down and to lose their seats, and for some reactionary upstarts to start moving through the institutions and changing what is acceptable? I think so. So nothing's going to happen in the next few months. Nothing's going to happen with the current parties as they stand. Is there an opportunity for rejuvenation in the future? Sure, we just have to have like our own sort of long march, and I hope that will happen.
Interesting. I wanted to talk about the Lotus Eaters in view of that. That is, of course, where your show is on. You know, there's some very interesting characters on there. Sargon of Akkad, Carl Benjamin. That was a man who was very instrumental in actually me converting to Catholicism. He got his videos got me reading Aristotle. And that it seems to be a very interesting coalition there. You also have Father Calvin Robinson on Lotus Eaters as well. What do you think? Is there a uniting mission when it comes to Lotus Eaters? What is the sort of umbrella that you all can get behind?
That's a difficult question to answer because we argue constantly. So what is nice is that we all vaguely would like to live in the same country. And that isn't an ideological country. Again, I sort of return to the idea of Britain as a nation of neighbors, where we have an established church, but not everyone's strong-armed into attending every Sunday. But, Doris might pop around and say, oh, I didn't see you at Mass this morning, so you really should drop in at some point this month. That sort of thing. There's a high level of interpersonal consideration. There's not much of a need for state intervention just because the moral texture of the country is so thickly woven that we care about each other enough to give good advice, and we uphold senses of fair play. And so it's hard to do a concrete mission statement like a political manifesto because we don't really have one. We just have strong sentiments, and we can diagnose the problems accurately and then try to change public perception so that people live the kind of Aristotelian lives that are full of virtue, that a revolution starts from the bottom up, while also, in pointing out so many of these problems, try and arm current or future sympathetic politicians to enact change in our given direction. But more broadly, I think the reason we break on perhaps the sort of moral substrata of the issues is because we don't have a unified faith at the office. So Father Calvin is an interesting mix of Anglo-Catholic. Carl calls himself a postmodern traditionalist, but I mean, lots of his family members are Christian, but he just, I think, out of a commitment to truth, he won't say that he is a Christian because he doesn't feel the belief, even though he likes everything about Christianity. I mean, he said himself, Richard Dawkins has kept saying over the last how many years, despite actively undermining the presence of Christianity in public life, that he's a cultural Christian. And Carl would put himself very much in the same box, but without denigrating the faith. He's almost said at times that he wishes he could believe, which is nice. We'll nudge him there. I believe only 2 of my other colleagues are active believers, but they're not denominational, and the rest are broadly atheist or agnostic. We have 2 quite impassioned atheists in the office, and so we've always locked horns, and 1 pagan, which is always interesting. But again, we have a sort of same vision of a considerate civilization that will allow us to accommodate one another. But that all being said, there have been people, again, in the anti-woke liberal camp who have been discontented about the drift of Lotus Eaters away from the sort of, have you even read Locke? I just wanted to play video games and stay quiet mentality of Cole's old channel in 2014, more towards a metaphysically rich, Christian sympathetic, or in many cases myself and Calvin, outwardly Christian belief system. And they've called me Catholic Wormtongue, which, I mean, I almost wear like a badge of pride at this point. If I can convince my colleagues to gravitate more towards a robust definition of what human dignity is and the source of it, and they can live wholesome and family-centered lives, then yeah, I'll take all the slings and arrows you guys throw at me.
Hey everyone, sorry to interrupt the video, but I did want to promote our paper. We don't just make videos online, we try to be the intellectual backbone for traditional Catholicism. And in the March issue, we talk about everything from Cardinal Newman's view on the Antichrist to Irish monasticism. So, if you want to subscribe to the paper, go over to CatholicFamilyNews.com or just use that link in the description. Something I find so refreshing about the Lotus Eaters, because, growing up, all you really had, at least what I had, is, Fox News playing in the living room with people, much older than you. Something I find so refreshing, though, is that Lotus Eaters is full of impassioned, exciting young men. And that's something I think we'll both agree is going to be key for a successful traditionalist political movement. How do you think we're supposed to attract those young men away from the materialism of the world, more towards this traditionalist view? What do you think is at the center there? What do you perceive as being a successful way to get those people on board?
I think you have to lean into the fact that what we're doing in reviving tradition and trying to make political change and also trying to influence positive personal change is that it is a calling in a sort of vocational sense, not necessarily to the priesthood, though they're more than welcome to if they feel that that's the role they would like to serve. But you need to give them a positive vision and how they can practically involve themselves and feel spiritually and morally and intellectually enriched. This is something that Professor Peterson did fantastically from around 2016 all the way through 2020, and then in dropping off the radar during lockdown because of his health issues and his subsequent involvement in more political matters, which I think, I've met Jordan only once or twice, and I fanboyed a little bit embarrassingly. So I really don't want to denigrate the fact that he's a bit of a possible hero of mine, but I think his moral and psychological lectures were more important than anything he could say on the matters of politics. But in dipping into politics, he's allowed a vacuum of sort of moral advice and preaching personal responsibility to be filled by a pornographer turned imam called Andrew Tate and a sort of orbit of lackeys in a series of materialistic and Darwinian grifters who have taken up the mantle of what was once called the manosphere. I'm thinking, for example, like the Fresh and Fit fellows, who at once say that you shouldn't get married and shouldn't have kids because modern women are such harlots. And then that is the Bailey which hides the mot of, I'm also an Islamist polygamist, and I also want to abort my babies, as we've heard on the leaked phone call recently. It only ever seems to cut one way, which is against the monogamous, wholesome Christianity. That seems to be what's denigrated, and in its place is upheld as sort of promiscuous Islamism, which I don't think is delightful. But the one strength they have is they do provide a positive vision. They're capitalizing on the resentment of many young men who have lost their fathers and lost their economic prowess and no longer being able, in many cases, to be single income providers, who have been stuck at home for 2 to 3 years during the pandemic with little in the way of anything to do or people to see, because they would be criminalized by their own government, especially in the UK. And also, it's largely, disproportionately, ethnic minorities who consume this content. And if they've been fed a diet of racial grievance narratives, if they don't gravitate towards the left just because they're radioactively uncool and they're flying the rainbow flag, then that grievance is still there, and it might be against the sort of female equivalent of the patriarchy. So it's ultimately acidic narrative on male self-sustenance. This is why you get lots of men sitting at home, sending in super chats to the Whatever podcast and spurting up the wall their revenge fantasies and their income on insulting OnlyFans models who are going to get paid either way and don't know you exist. Instead, what you need is a sort of in shape, vitalistic, well-spoken series of men, what my friend Chris Williamson calls the third wave manosphere, who both embody the aesthetics and can also make a compassionate but also stern articulation of what you've been deprived of, but also what you have to do to reclaim what is essentially both your birthright and your obligation, which is to uphold and improve civilization, to impart it off onto your own children, to, with paternalistic concern, care for your dependent wife and your children, and to go from being the man who can bear heavy loads physically to bear emotional loads in your old age as some sort of like village elder or a statesman. And that needs to be the positive vision put forth. And I think that's what I'm not hearing enough of yet. But the fact that I complained that I didn't hear enough of that on trigonometry recently, and my episode did disproportionately well compared to the amount of days that it's been out on recent interviews, means that there is a real hunger for it. So I'm happy to play my part, but I definitely think there are going to be lots of well-experienced men, particularly, I hope to be soon, but who are already husbands and fathers who can put that message forward.
Let me ask you, when it comes to young men who might see the problem with a sort of Andrew Tate type of manosphere, and they come to accept, okay, Christianity is the underlying foundation of Western civilization, and that's where I can find meaning in my life. really the only it's changed because recently, like even 3-4 years ago, traditional Catholics were really the only prominent people talking about this with a large following. But now, of course, we have Eastern Orthodox, popular Eastern Orthodox people who are suggesting the same thing. You've got Reformed Calvinists. Of course, Father Robinson is promoting a sort of more ecumenical old Catholic perspective. We are in a terrible crisis in the church where, as you mentioned, some things there's issues with Pope Francis and some of the practices today. What do you think we can say to people to convince them that out of all these choices that take that same foundation of Christianity being true, Catholicism is the way you should go?
I think it has the most robust doctrine of why you deserve dignity, but also why you have responsibility to others, and that is the teaching of Imago Dei. So one of the this might be an uncomfortable issue to anchor it into, but one of the main things that a lot of young men have said for my show, on shows like John Doyle, who's also a fellow Catholic, to Michael Knowles, to Matt Walsh, is that they suffered from pornography addiction in lieu of having a relationship. And you can make moral arguments about the fact that you can never verify the consent of the participants, about the fact that likely the types of women that go into this, that you don't know their history, so they might well have had childhood abuse or substance dependencies. You can say that the suicide rate is 6 times that of the normal population for porn participants, but that doesn't always land on deaf ears if they aren't feeling particularly sympathetic towards a abstract category that you think that has deprived them of their right to be husbands, fathers, protectors, providers, and the like. And so what you can say is, okay, well, here's this doctrine of innate human dignity, and this is the supposition that all of the best civilizations that you idolize have operated off of in their legal code, even if they haven't explicitly said it. And straying away from this has caused all sorts of issues with the fact that people have abandoned their dependent obligations. And for example, if you didn't grow up with a dad in the home, then a culture which says that children themselves are not worthy of protection because they're an innocent human life, that is why you were deprived of your father, and don't you want to revive that kind of belief? Or aren't you owed something better than sitting at home, being dispossessed, staring endlessly onto a screen, either be a video game or pornography or something like that? Aren't you called to something more by the virtue of you have inherited this innate human dignity that you cannot create, you cannot destroy, and you should be grateful for? And you should impart that gratitude onto others who are worthy dependents, who really deserve it, who you like having in your life. And so you should work to earn to keep their attention in your life. So that's a sort of cascading sense of responsibilities out from an original divine principle, which I think we have the monopoly on. And I think as well, on an aesthetic level, as I was saying with the sort of manosphere before, you need to live the proof, right? I think that the reason that a lot of Gen Z are gravitating towards Latin mass going Catholicism, like there was a recent Independent article, Independent being a rag over in the UK, that was lamenting the rise of trad caths on TikTok. There was a recent Spectator article that was saying that there is a religious revival underway in the UK, and I can speak to the fact that there are a lot of people working in politics going to a particular Latin mass society in South London. There's a reason why the Latin mass going Catholics have one of the highest birth rates. By the way, I still go to Novus Ordo because, again, I take my nan. But just the aesthetics alone and the reverence to tradition, it directs our attention towards something which is not within ourselves. And that constant focus on the self is what is leaving a lot of young men bereft of purpose, bereft of a sense of identity and meaning. And so if you can found the argument for moving towards Catholicism in an innate and imparted sense of human worth, Imago Dei, from which flows your responsibility to worthy dependence, and a sense of hierarchy and beauty and something outside yourself which calls to your attention, that means that you aren't just stuck on disposable content all the time, which is sucking your soul out, then I think that will make an appealing case to them. And then all you've got to start going is, okay, it might feel inauthentic at first, because what you're doing is you're essentially reclaiming something that you never grew up knowing. But to be the virtuous man in the Aristotelian sense, you've got to be the continent man first. Like, you've got to intellectualize it, rationally adopt it, habituate it, and then it becomes a second nature. And so I think we'll see a sort of passing from through habituation from continence to virtue over the course of a generation, hopefully.
Connor, to sort of bring these things to a synthesis, do you have any advice for, let's say you've got young men out there who they might be struggling with the addictions of this world, attachment to the world. They see the value in the traditions of Western culture, but at the same time, they hear all these voices around them telling them wildly different things, and the stakes seem high. Do you have any advice towards those young men practically about what they can do to straighten their lives up and become good contributors to their people, to their society, and ultimately to God?
First, listen to your intuitions, because it seems that the Progressive Project has been a technological and philosophical enterprise to free people who are interested into things that they know are bad for them from their own conscience, right? This is the Pride Parade. This is why all of civilization needs to validate the fact that your sexual preferences don't actually stop affecting your personality through the magic portal of the bedroom door. And actually, you really don't hope that this comes up in conversation. So you need to normalize it so that if it ever does come up in conversation, not only is it acceptable, but you're actually celebrated as a liberated person showing your authentic self, right? But the fact that these people perpetually revolutionize culture means that they're never quite happy with themselves. And so if you're sitting there and you feel that you're wasting your time on playing endless rounds of Fortnite or Overwatch or whatever it was, I mean, believe me, I genuinely used to be addicted to first-person shooters. Like, I was very good at them. And I just threw all of my adolescent social life into them for a number of years. So I'm in this cohort, right? If you, as a young man, feel discouraged because you've filled your frame of reference with whatever podcast clips and horror stories about false Me Too allegations, and so you think that you can just watch pornography and get your biological release, and that has no impact on your motivation, both for a relationship and broadly to advance in the world. If you listen to that voice in your gut that tells you you could be doing more and that you know this is kind of wrong, if you allow that to lead you, then you will take concrete action down the road. Now, the concrete action that I advise people take, I mean, if it's pornography addiction, I mean, install various blockers on your browser and then make up a password, ensure you put it in, and then forget it. I suppose that would be a useful thing, or at least have sort of like filters on certain websites that you can't go and access them. Because if you keep the temptations out of your purview, then you're less likely to do them. It's very difficult if you're trying to curate, a Twitter and Instagram feed without any sexualized content on it, because I've never been a pornography addict, but if you're a man, it defaults to the fact that it thinks you want to see half-naked women, so you've got to, clear all that off. But I sympathize. But it's the same as an alcoholic not buying booze in the household, right? If it's not in the house, you aren't tempted with it. And then get outside of yourself. So make sure that you have very offline hobbies. Turn all your social media notifications off. It's what I do, and I use this for a living, right? And it's very beneficial. Go and concretely take family members to church. If your church is quite feminine, ensure you participate proactively in church activities, so you reinstantiate the sort of masculine spirit of hierarchy and excellence, not just sort of woolly egalitarian, let's stand in the corner and clap hands and have an acoustic guitar like it's campfire or something. And obviously, I want to provide as much encouragement as I can, and I'm going to do a debate next week on my show about marriage, because I get a lot of pushback when I still push for this. As much encouragement as I can to young men who are deterred from pursuing relationships, particularly in the natural institution of marriage, because American family and divorce courts are way worse than that in the UK. In the UK, they're bad, right? So I understand a lot of men's risk aversion. The most likely place you're going to find a woman who is a priori committed to not having a divorce, who believes in the institution of marriage, who you can take the leap of faith that has the same values as you, and so you don't have to be risk averse enough to need a prenup or a contract or anything like that, is the Catholic Church. So that's good to gravitate towards. But a lot of young men haven't seen the values of an intact family because they haven't had one. And a lot of young men have also been badly burned in prior relationships. I've got some horror stories of some ex-girlfriends. Believe me, again, I'm well within the paradigm. But it's actually really helpful to believe that everything's your fault. yes, you've had things taken away from you for political circumstances and various grievance groups you have no control over. But to turn around and say, everyone that is in my life is a consequence of how I think about myself. If you examine every single one of the relationships that you've had and that you currently have, and if you find yourself discontented with how they're playing out, then think about what that says about what you think about yourself, fix yourself, and then sort those relationships accordingly. And if you have people in your orbit who only will the good in you, who truly love you, then you're going to have a much more wholesome life, and you're going to be happy actually serving their interests rather than just serving yourself.
Connor, that's amazing advice and just excellent all around. Connor, where can people find your content?
So I am at @con_Tomlinson on X and Instagram, where I put up little clips because I'm often on places like GB News, Talk TV, Sky News Australia, and the most of my video content is over at lotuseaters.com, where I am live with Tomlinson Talks, which is mainly a monologuing show, but I have usually 1 or 2 guests every week as well, from Wednesday weekdays, and that's at 3 o'clock UK time. And we also do the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, at 1 o'clock UK time, where I and some of my other co-hosts sit down and discuss the news of the day, usually from a UK-centric perspective. We occasionally comment on cultural matters, US politics, European politics, and the like. And the rest of my colleagues' content, which I can highly advise, including where I occasionally show up as a guest, is behind the paywall over at lotuseaters.com. And it's cheaper than a couple of cups of coffee a month, helps us keep the lights on, and I can attest to how spiritually nourishing it is.
Yeah, I can as well. You all do great work over there. So, we'll have the links to all that in the description. And if you want to subscribe to Catholic Family News, you can go to CatholicFamilyNews.com or click the link that we'll also have in the description. So, Connor, thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, to our audience, may God grant you many joyful years. Have a good one.